Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. This morning we'll be looking at a very important Old Testament prophecy. This prophecy is normally given the title, The Prophecy of Daniel's 70 Weeks. An angel of the Lord came to Daniel and gave him a prophecy about what would take place during a 490-year time period. That's what we'll be looking at this morning. Why is this prophecy so important? Well, how we interpret this prophecy will then affect how we interpret the prophecy of Matthew chapter 24. That's a prophecy the Lord himself gave concerning the future events of the world in Matthew chapter 24. Not only that, the way that we see this prophecy in Daniel will affect how we interpret the book of Revelation as well. So this prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks of Daniel, is a very important prophecy. And it's very important that we come to a proper understanding of this. Now, let me just tell you real quickly. On my blog, settledinheaven.wordpress.com, I have the notes to this lesson. Because I'm limited to time here on YouTube, okay, I can't take as much time to explain these things as I would like to. My notes have a much more full explanation of this prophecy than what I can ever begin to cover on this video. So my notes are going to fill in a lot of gaps that I'm going to have to leave in the teaching on the video. Not only that, on my WordPress blog, I also have a chart you can download. I have it in PowerPoint. I have it in JPEG, and I believe I also have it in PDF formats, if I'm not mistaken. I have it in several formats for you to download freely, whichever format works best for you. And I think the chart will help you very much to understand what I'm teaching in the video. As a matter of fact, if it's possible, if you'd like to go to my WordPress blog now and get the chart, it might help you as I go down through these verses on the video. But in either case, I think if you eventually make your way to my blog and you get this information, it'll help you very much to understand what I'm trying to teach. Here in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, what we have is a listing of different events that will take place in a 490-year time period. We're told in verse 24 it's 70 weeks, but again in my notes we'll cover all of this, but the 70 weeks here is really talking about 490 years. The Hebrew word for weeks is the word groups of 7, so when you talk about 70 groups of 7, that's 490. It's 490 years. You can see in chapter 9 verse number 2, the context of this vision that Daniel receives is he's searching for how God is going to be working with the physical nation of Judah in years. If you notice in verse 2, he's looking at a year. He's saying, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. So in the context, Daniel is searching out how God's going to deal with Israel. And in the context, we're clearly told it's years. That Daniel is, he has a mindset looking at years. When we get over here to Daniel 9:24 and it says 70 weeks, in Hebrew that means 70 groups of 7. Well, since we know the context of what Daniel's looking at is in years, we're talking about 70 groups of 7 years. And again, I get into more detail in my written notes on why we believe it's years. But let's just take it for granted. This is 490 years we're talking about. So this prophecy covers a 490-year time period. During this 490-year time period, many different events are going to take place that this prophecy covers. Okay? This 490-year time period is broken up into 3 parts. And let me give this to you first before we go any farther. Part number 1 we find in verse number 25. Down and about the middle it says, unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay. The 7 weeks there is the first part of this 490-year time period. The 7 weeks being talked about there is equivalent to 49 years. Remember, it's 7 groups of 7 years. So it's 49 years. So the first part of this prophecy has a division of 49 years in it. The next division in this prophecy is 62 weeks long. In other words, that's 62 weeks, or 62 groups of sevens. So that would be 434 years long. The final part of this prophecy is 1 week in length. If you notice in verse 27, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. That 1 week makes up the fulfillment then of the 490 years. So take the 49 years plus 434 years plus 7 years. 49 plus 434 plus 7, that gives you 490 years. So I just want you to understand again in your mind, this whole prophecy is 490 years, but it's broken up into 3 parts. You have a part that's 49 years long, a part that's 434 years long, and a part that is 7 years long. Okay, very quickly, what's this prophecy start with? It starts with the decree of Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem. You notice that in verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, or Messiah the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, so the beginning of this 490-year time period is Cyrus's initial decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Cyrus was an emperor. He's Medo-Persian emperor. He decreed that Jerusalem could be rebuilt. That decree went out in 457 BC. Now, let me just tell you, if you study in history, you'll find there were other decrees later that went out to reestablish Cyrus's decree and to add to Cyrus's decree. But the original decree to rebuild Jerusalem was given by Cyrus in 457 BC. That is the beginning point of our prophecy. Now, do you remember we said this prophecy is divided up into 3 parts? The first part was 49 years long. Okay? If Cyrus's decree begins this prophecy, what takes place after 49 years? The temple was completed. Remember, Cyrus makes a decree in 457 for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Do you know what? Jerusalem, the temple in the city, was rebuilt, and that was completed in 407 BC. That's talked about at the end of verse 25. The street shall be built again in the wall, even in troublesome times. So that's what took place during that first 49-year period. You have Cyrus decreeing Jerusalem should be rebuilt. And during that time, they rebuild Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem is completed in 407 BC. That takes place during the first 49 years of this prophecy. Okay? If you remember, then it went on and it said we now have a 434-year gap between the temple being completed and what? The coming of the Messiah. If you notice in verse 25, unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So it's saying once the temple at Jerusalem is completed in 407 BC, until Messiah the Prince comes, in other words, he starts his earthly ministry, that's a period of 434 years. Okay, let's use the dates again. The temple completed is at 407 BC. Christ was baptized and began his ministry 26 AD. From 407 BC to 26 AD is approximately 434 years. Okay, so that's the 434-year gap. Okay, what takes place then in this last week? Remember we said this was divided into 3 different parts. The last part is 1 week. That would be 7 years. What takes place in this last 7-year time period? We know it starts with the beginning of the ministry of the Messiah. What takes place? Look at this. After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. This is verse 26, but not for himself. The people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Okay? It says after that 62 week period, that would be the period we're in now, this last week period, Messiah is going to be cut off. That's exactly what took place. Christ was cut off in the middle of that 7-year time period. If you notice down in verse 27, it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. When Christ died on the cross in the middle of that last week, he caused an end to come to the Old Testament sacrifices and oblations. The sacrifices were the blood sacrifices when they brought animals and they slew the animals and shed the animals' blood. Oblations are the other offerings they brought that didn't involve blood, like drink offerings and the meal offering, that type of thing. All of the Old Testament ceremonial law came to an end when Christ died on the cross because he fulfilled that ceremonial law. It says Christ was cut off in the midst of the week. In other words, in the middle of that last 7-year time period is when Christ was cut off. That's exactly right. If Christ's ministry began in 26 AD, most people believe he was crucified 3 years later, 3.5 years later. That would be 30 AD. So Christ actually died on the cross in 30 AD, bringing an end to the Old Testament ceremonial law. But notice something else happened too. As a result of his death, not only did he bring an end to the Old Testament ceremonial law, but it says, and the people of the princes shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and with an end thereof shall be with a flood. Unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Desolations in plural. Do you know, we all know what desolate means. Like a desert is desolate, meaning it doesn't have any life in it. You know, it has very few life, just a few cactuses maybe, and very few animal life in the desert. It's a desolate area. It has very little life, if any. Here we're told that in conjunction with the death of Christ, a desolation or desolations, a twofold desolation actually upon Israel would take place. Okay. When the Israelites rejected Jesus Christ as their Messiah and they crucified him, God placed his judgment upon them. It was a twofold judgment. It was a desolation that was spiritual and physical in nature. Okay. The spiritual desolation was he would remove his worship from their nation now. Remember before, in times past in the Old Testament, when God gave truth to mankind, it came through Israel. He handed the words to Israel, the physical Jews. They would take the word, they would spread it among their nation. They were the containers of truth in the Old Testament, basically. No more nowadays. Nowadays, you have Gentile nations picking up where the nation of Israel left off. Why? Because now the physical nation of Israel, for the most part, is a desolate nation. They do not accept Christ as a Messiah to this day. When do we see that desolation first taking place? The spiritual aspect of that desolation. When the gospel began to go to the Gentiles. Remember when Peter went to Cornelius' house and he saw the Gentiles had the gospel? And he saw that they were accredited with the gospel there at Cornelius' house? From that point forward, you see the spiritual desolation of Israel taking place. Not only was the desolation against Israel spiritual because they rejected the Messiah, it was also physical in nature. The physical nation of Israel, they would be cast out of the nation. The land area would become desolate. It wouldn't just be that they would be lacking spiritual truth. They would actually be lacking life because they would be cast out of their nation. No longer would you have Jews populating that area and living in that area. It was only in, 1948 that they returned to that area. Until then, that area was desolate of Israelites, of Jews. So you can see the judgment against the Israelites because they crucified Christ was twofold, physical and spiritual. Okay. Here, when we're talking about this people of the prince coming and surrounding the city and causing it to be desolate, that's talking about something that took place in 70 AD. When Titus, the armies of Titus came in, they surrounded Israel, they invaded Israel, and they ended up making it desolate. At 70 AD, you have the completion of that twofold desolation take place. When Titus came in, they drove the people out and killed many of the Jews. Physical desolation, but also they destroyed the temple. Spiritual desolation. Both were made complete by Titus in 70 AD. So sure enough, when the verse here talks about Christ being cut off in the midst of the week, and then linking that to the idea of Israel becoming desolate, that's what it's talking about. In 70 AD, when Titus came in and his people, they caused the twofold desolation of Israel to be complete. One more thing to fill in real quick, the blank, and then we're going to close. We said this all took place in a 490-year time period as far as Christ's death on the cross and all the fulfillment of his death and the results of his death. What was the ending point of this 490-year time period? Peter going to Cornelius' house. That took place in 33 AD. Now that's not mentioned here in the prophecy, but that's the one event that took place in history that was exactly 490 years after Cyrus' decree. Peter went to Cornelius' house. He saw the gospel going to the Gentiles, and at that point in time it was accredited because you could see the Holy Spirit at work in Cornelius' house. That was the accreditation that God gave to Peter to prove, yes, Peter, this desolation is taking place. This spiritual desolation of Israel is taking place. The physical desolation of Israel would soon take place as well. So during this 490-year time period, you have many different events take place. These 490 years, I believe without a doubt, are consecutive years that begin with the decree of Cyrus. They end with the gospel being going out to the Gentiles. Just a little bit after that, you have Titus totally wiping out the nation of Israel and the worship in the nation. And before that, slightly before the end, you have Christ's public ministry, fulfilling much of what you read about in verse number 24, as well as in verses 25, 26, and 27. Okay, again, if you go to my notes, you can see a verse-by-verse commentary that shows each verse of what they teach in their entirety, listed out what Christ achieved when he died on the cross and what Christ did in each of these verses. But please, folks, keep in mind, this is Daniel's 70 weeks. It's a consecutive 490-year time period. And it shows basically how God ended up dealing with the physical nation of Israel because they rejected their Messiah. In their rejection of the Messiah, he accomplished much of God's plan for redemption. But also they received severe judgment because of the fact they rejected the Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you very much for spending this time with me. I trust he'll bless you as you study his word.